Welcome to Books and Bridges, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We continue our discussion series on treasures of world literature. Tonight we delve into that loose, baggy monster of a classic, War and Peace. Most people admire this novel for its grand historical sweep or for its panoramic view of Russia as a great power. But less appreciated is its deep gaze into the moral struggle of the individual soul. Books and Bridges is a public humanities institute of ideas and conversation. We examine the best of human thought in friendship and civility. For funding this event, let me thank Utah Humanities. I'm your host, Nathan Nielsen, and our guest is the brilliant, witty, and funny Mark Purves. Let me just read you his bio. Mark Purves received his PhD in Slavic languages and literatures from the University of Virginia in 2006. He is now Associate Professor of Russian at Brigham Young University. He has written about Anton Chekhov, modern drama, Yuri Alyosha, and Russian modernism. Dr. Purves teaches courses ranging from Greek tragedy, the classic Russian novel, and the works of Fyodor Dostoevsky and Lev Tolstoy. In 2017, Dr. Purves was named an Alcuin Fellow in the Honors Department at BYU. He is currently working on a monograph about the dimensions of disillusionment and joy in Anton Chekhov. Dr. Purves enjoys golfing with his sons, figuring out his daughters, and arguing with his friends. He has been a member of the International Sinatra Society since 1993. So by the time this event is over tonight, maybe we'll get a dance from Dr. Purves, who knows? Well, I turn the time over to you, Mark. Tell us about this great novel, War and Peace.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. This is an unusual experience for me. I've never been part of a webinar, which I've been told is the experience of speaking into a black space and then fielding questions from people that you cannot see. So essentially it's a metaphor for my own life. I'm sort of throwing out words that will never be returned to me with any kind of significance or understanding. So for those of you who are there somewhere, thank you so much for tuning in, as they say. So there's really just a few things I want to mention about this novel. Namely, I just want to point out that Tolstoy was adamant that this should not be read as a novel. So the very genre itself, the novel, implied something frivolous with that featured stock characters who pursued sort of clear objectives, always operating at these sort of broad macro levels. And he wasn't interested in that. And Tolstoy, in a very grumpy mood, he was asked by readers at the time, so what is War and Peace? And the closest he ever comes, I mean, he's very grumpy about it. He pretty much says, look, Tolstoy, or he says, War and Peace is exactly what the author intended it to be, which is almost an entirely unhelpful, right, statement about the novel itself. And so when Henry James did sort of classify the work as a loose, baggy monster, he wasn't entirely wrong, because Tolstoy doesn't have in his mind sort of the clear conventions that we anticipate that are associated with the novel itself. Now, Anna Karenina is a novel by his own design, but we don't need to talk about that now. I know some of my own students are joining in tonight's discussion, and they're actually in the process of taking exam about Anna Karenina this week, so they probably don't want to discuss it at all. That's all right. There was an Edwardian critic who wrote that the novel was a, quote, confusion of design, and the book had no center, and that Tolstoy was so unconcerned by it that one must conclude that he never even perceived it. Now, Russians, however, feel differently. So Mikhail Kusmian, very important early 20th century Russian writer, finishing War and Peace for the 10th time, he wrote in his journal, he said, I finally understand my life for the first time. So that was after 10 readings of War and Peace. So that should give you an idea that this is a work which not only encourages, but rewards rereading. I mean, I, for instance, have only read it 17 times. No, okay. So one of Russia's sort of grumpiest writers, Vladimir Nabokov, gave the novel an A. He gave Tolstoy an A, and some of you may be familiar with this. He listed sort of the great Russian writers, right? And Tolstoy gets an A, and some of you may be familiar with this. He gave Dostoevsky a Z minus. So just to give you an idea, but there are some wonderful photographs of Nabokov and his wife traveling across the United States, reading War and Peace as Nabokov is writing. I believe it's Lolita, though it could be something else. Pasternak probably comes the closest in offering his evaluation, defining War and Peace as, quote, a squarish chunk of hot smoking conscience. I don't really know exactly what that means, but it sounds pretty good to me. It sounds right. Now, as to my own experience with War and Peace, I have to acknowledge an unabashed love. There are really a few things, really 3 points, three sort of main ideas that I like to address when I think about War and Peace. The first is this idea of what constitutes an official history, because so much of what is motivating Tolstoy behind this novel is his sort of consternation over what he considers to be authentic written histories and inauthentic written histories. And so much of the novel, you could say, is sort of his attempt to sort of hold up, right? If you were to ask Tolstoy, in other words, all right, so how should history be written, right? You can imagine him sort of holding up his copy and saying, well, here it is, it's called War and Peace, and this is how history should be written. And I'll point out a few different instances where that's the case. My edition, of course, is not in the best shape. It's fallen apart. I tell people this is war and this is peace. Though clearly my favorite translation is left to the masters of cozy classics and their edition of War and Peace. And I used to make it a habit as a teacher. I used to bring my small sons into the class and I'd tell my students, look, don't complain about how long War and Peace is. And I'd have them read, so here's Hurt and there's Andre on this side. And my sons would read it aloud to the class and I'd say, well, look, if these 5 and 6-year-olds can read War and Peace in a matter of a few minutes, then you have nothing to complain about. So that was my attempt at humor, which I thought, went fantastically well. So, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, why some readers might be sort of turned off simply by the bulk of the work itself. So competing interpretations of War and Peace arise, I think, out of Tolstoy's misgivings with what he calls the, quote, official histories, which overemphasized the role of a few individuals in creating and capitalizing on what we would call, quote, watershed moments. So in my view, for Tolstoy, there are no watershed moments, just a series of connected events, too innumerable to recount. So for Tolstoy, for the author, historians must do more than simply provide a description of events, but rather explore how people felt about those events as they unfolded. So to articulate this point, Tolstoy infuses his account of the Napoleonic campaign with fictional moments that somehow feel more real than, say, the sort of coarse language of seasoned soldiers or the size of the yellow pimples dotting Napoleon's flabby, effeminate back. I mean, Tolstoy is such a Russian when it comes to his depiction of Napoleon. He can't just say Napoleon is a bad guy. He has to say he's effeminate and flabby and pimply. Right? He can't just leave it there. And there's this wonderful moment in Crime and Punishment where you have this, there's this dream sequence where this woman assumes the visage of a French prostitute, right? Always French with these Russian authors, right? That's how you know these people are really sort of suspect. Anyway, so for instance, you think of in the backdrop of the Battle of Smolensk, when Andre, right, sort of one of the main figures of this novel, is rushing home. I'm going to make use of the edition that I read with my class. So It's this really, I think, sort of wonderful moment. And an instance, I think, of what Tolstoy would say, look, this is what constitutes an authentic history. So even as Russia is sort of burning down and Smolensk is being burnt to the ground, which will sort of signal this catalyst, this catalyzing moment in history, right? What Prince Andrei is sort of stumbles across are these two girls, these two peasant girls who are stealing plums. And this is the remarkable line. He says, the little creatures had one burning ambition to pinch those green plums and scoff them without getting caught. And Prince Andrei wished them well in their enterprise. He could not resist another glance. Feeling safe at last, they had nipped out of their hiding places and they were off. And they were singing and they're sunburnt and all this sort of thing. It's a moment that I think is highly significant for Tolstoy, in the sense that this is a moment that the official historian would completely neglect, would completely ignore. More importantly is Andrei's sort of growing sense that there are lives outside of his own, that there are people with opinions he doesn't share and experiences he's never considered. And so in many ways, as a historical account, War and Peace reads like a catalog of unimportant moments that somehow shape our lives in massive ways. And maybe this is what, resonates with Virginia Woolf's comment that, if God could write, he would write like Tolstoy. Now, I like that sentiment because I like Tolstoy. Now, whether that's true or not, that's something else. Now, another illustration of what historians lack is Tolstoy's inclusion of seemingly sort of throwaway moments, right? Moments where you could take them out of the novel and it wouldn't change anything at all. And yet those moments somehow prove crucial in the lives of the characters. So I'm thinking about the first time Andrei and Natasha dance. This is page 500. I suspect that doesn't help anyone, but it's just sort of my way of doing things. I love this. This is in chapter 17. I think it's part 2. There's this wonderful paragraph. It says, Prince Andrei loved dancing. Now for Tolstoy, that's important because masculinity is tied to dancing for Tolstoy. If you've read Anna Karenina, you also know that Levin, for instance, he's a good ice skater. So true men know how to dance. True men know how to dance. They know how to ice skate, right? That's not made to count against them. Anyway, he begins to dance with Natasha, and we're told that he broke into these conversations, was also keen to break the irksome ring of constraint caused by the presence of the Tsar. So what happens at this moment is you have Tolstoy is focusing on this dance, this lovely sort of exchange between Andrei and Natasha. And who else is there at the scene? The Tsar himself, as though Tolstoy is sort of saying, look, the official historical account would focus on the arrival and the presence of the Tsar. But I'm actually going to show you something much more significant that's taking place. And that's this dance, which, if we weren't properly attuned to it, we would probably miss. I feel like I'm speaking too quickly. Is that
No, you're fine.
Feeling?
No, you're doing fine.
Thank you.
Keep going.
Okay. Now, one of the reasons we like art, if we do, is that it reopens us in some sense. Kafka wrote in a letter to a friend, he said that art breaks the sea that's frozen inside of us. What I mean to say is it reminds us, good art reminds us of sensitivities that we might have lost at some cost. It's as though one is struggling to be as inert as possible, while at the same time struggling against one's own inertia. So in its depiction of what we think we want, War and Peace, in my mind, is most suited to do the work of reopening us in our struggle against inertia. And this is what I call the tyranny of elsewhere. It's a concept I've called the tyranny of elsewhere. And this is illustrated throughout the novel. And one of the most sort of devastatingly beautiful instances of this has to do with Andrei and his sister Maria. And this is Andrei before he goes off to war. for reasons, if you remember, he can't even articulate. He doesn't even know why he's going off to war, except to do something great, and he wants to get away from his wife. An impulse perhaps that we all maybe relate to, but there have to be better reasons to going off to war than simply than that. So before Andre heads off to battle, his sister Maria, his devout sister, places an icon around his neck. It's a very famous moment in the novel, and it's captured quite beautifully in the Bondarchuk film from the early 1960s. Andre, however, is unfazed by Maria's affection. And the line is, quote, I'm reading this now. Andre's, quote, handsome eyes were shining with an unusual brightness and kindness, but he was looking past his sister's head through the open door into the darkness beyond. Andre is so caught up in the future. He's so caught up in proving his worth on the field of battle that he neglects the tenderness that might otherwise make his present significant. And most of us, I think, can relate to this, namely our belief that we're not living the right life. We then get hung up on some alternative that seems within our grasp, but forever out of reach. Our fascination, that is to say, our fascination is with what we can never do, as though we were all born at the wrong time, we were all born to the wrong body, to wrong luck. But there could be something comforting to this. Namely, because we cannot live any other life but our own, we needn't worry too much about trying to live the life that we think we're missing. Adam Phillips said recently, quote, don't be tyrannized by the part of yourself that's only interested in elsewhere. One of the greatest forms of misery is experienced when we are preoccupied by what we think we're missing, by what we feel that we've lost, and there's no way around it. The novel also offers sort of insights into how to live well. And in order to do this, Tolstoy focuses his attention on the main characters as children. And so we begin the lives of Nikolai Rostov and Natasha, and even Pierre to some degree, right, as sort of children in a sense. And only to sort of follow the process by which these characters develop. They make huge mistakes and then learn from them as a result. For me, my favorite character in this novel, it has to be Pierre. I identify with Pierre. He is portly and bespectacled, and I can relate to both of those things. He never says the right thing at the right time. One of the best lines for me in the novel was, Pierre nie umiał wejść w salon. Pierre lacked the ability to enter a room. And if you've ever felt sort of socially awkward, then Pierre is sort of your guy. And he's kind of a dope. And even though he undergoes these really poignant, telling moments in his life, he's still kind of a dope at the end, which is, I think, is sort of Tolstoy again asking us to be sort of suspicious of this idea that, look, just because you go through certain life-changing events, they don't really change you in the way that you anticipate. Pierre's kind of a dope at the beginning, and he's sort of a dope at the end. And I love that about Pierre. And one of Pierre's sort of, one way that Tolstoy traces Pierre's maturation is indicated in Pierre's last name itself. So his surname in the novel, Bezukhov, right? My Russian students who are joining in on this, and as most of you know, Bezukhov, right? Meaning without ears. His name is Peter Earless, which is a sort of funny way to begin one's life. And throughout the rest of the novel, what Pierre has to do is learn to develop a proper ear, if you will, to the right voices that are guiding and helping his life. And if some of you remember, it's one of the funniest scenes in this entire novel, where Pierre sort of allows himself to be manipulated into this horrible marriage. But he does so because, as we're told, the line was, he had to rid himself of this agonizing uncertainty. And so part of Pierre's process is learning to give proper ear to the voices that want what's best for Pierre, and to avoid and hopefully sort of ignore the voices that wish the opposite. And there are a few famous sort of moments which discuss this. And I think one of them has to be read together. Let me grab. So this is in part 4 of War and Peace. Clearly, that's what we're reading, right? Yes, and this is a very sort of well-known moment. Now, this is after, Nathan, can I mention, are we spoilers, that sort of thing? I mean,
Sure. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it seems like, I mean, the novel is published in 1869. If you don't know what happens at this point, then you know, sorry, but we can't be held responsible for, you know, spoiling certain events. But this is after Pierre's experience as a prisoner of war, where he is gradually sort of deprived of everything that he has. And this process of gradual divestment, which is so important for Pierre in order to become the person that Tolstoy intends him to be. And we're told that under this life of severe depredation, Pierre comes to discover some important lessons. And this is something that stands out. My students tend to like this description very much. We're told Pierre looked across the meadow at the steady movement of wagons and men on horseback, then right out over the river, then at the dog who was making a good show of really wanting to bite him. Then he looked down at his bare feet, twisting them about with enormous pleasure and wriggling his big, thick, dirty toes. And every time he looked at his bare feet, his face lit up with a bright smile of contentment. And there are these moments where even, right, as a prisoner, Pierre develops an inner zone, if you will, an inner voice by which he's able to distinguish from what used to matter for him to now what actually is significant, now which is most important. And it's these sort of the grandeur of these simple pleasures which characterize sort of a life well lived in this novel. So Nikolai Rostov, after having dreamed of being sort of the new Tsar and trying to prove himself as the new Napoleon, Andrei thinks about this as well. One of the main things that Nikolai Rostov discovers at the end of the novel is the line is, he learned to value the beauty of a good shave and a clear early morning, right? These are the things that matter. It's not any sort of idea of deep philosophical significance, but rather, you know, what Leonard Cohen used to sing about, upheld by the simplicity of pleasure. And for me, that's my experience reading the novel. It's a total and complete joy, but it also, I think, will sustain us no matter what path we embark on. So those are my sort of paraphrastic, scattered thoughts about War and Peace. And what I'm more interested in hearing are your thoughts and questions about the novel. Nathan, is that okay?
Yeah. Yeah, please feel free to submit your questions by the chat button. I just like to start out with a comment or a question myself. One of the things that strikes me most about War and Peace is that the flow of the story is always happening on these parallel tracks. One seems to be the inner kind of invisible track of what is going on in the soul of the character. And Tolstoy makes that very visible to the reader, but it's interior. And then kind of the echo of this accumulation of all of these inner sensations, inner struggles, you have this kind of grand panoramic view of what is happening in the nation as a people. Do you think that Tolstoy looked at the soul as kind of like the originator of all human events, and everything else is just a kind of random or arbitrary collection into a narrative we call history?
So could you rephrase the question?
That was very well. What I mean is that Tolstoy seems to be very suspicious of anyone trying to define what history is. And it seems like, and tell me if you think this is correct, is for Tolstoy, is history for him what happens in the individual soul and how that kind of adds up over in a collective, in a society? Is that is that the base of it?
Yeah. So much of his approach short history is premised on this idea that there's no such thing as a great man or a great woman, that there are no central historical figures that we talk about who actually help to shape this or that or moved society right in this direction or that direction. That's the work of historians in retrospect who want to right sort of associate big ideas with certain individuals. And Tolstoy he doesn't like this idea at all. And in fact, he makes a point of saying, and this is in relation to Nikolai Rostov, that those who were simply going about sort of attending the duties of everyday life, he calls them the main movers and shakers of their day. That there seems to be, and this is definitely true in Anna Karenina, there's sort of this ethics of the ordinary. That what Tolstoy is in a sense saying is, you make the most amount of difference in your life by not trying to make the most amount of difference. That the people who actively intend to sort of shape our lives are frauds and hypocrites or crashing bores. And they're either way, they're not to be trusted. It's people who sort of do the sort of ordinary things, right? The ethics of paying your taxes and mowing your lawn and changing poopy diapers and things like that. That there's in fact greater moral value to those sort of ordinary activities than there is to any sort of grand sweeping gesture. And that's a sort of a conventional approach to sort of Tolstoy's thoughts on history. What's interesting, I mean, there's an inescapable irony. I mean, Tolstoy is in a sense saying, look, don't believe any of the written histories. Oh, but mine you can definitely believe.
Mm-hmm.
So
there's something about an artistic explanation that is truer than a factual explanation, would he say?
I mean, some historians would argue that by taking a historical account and reframing it within the context of fiction, it ornamentalizes the whole process, and thus it sort of diminishes it of its authenticity and its significance.
Do you know who Brandon Carraway is? He's asking a question. Let me read it. He says, what do you feel Tolstoy's views on war were?
What does he
What are
think
his
about
views
war?
on war? Yeah.
I mean, well, let me put it like this. I think what bothers Tolstoy almost more than anything isn't so much war, but the allowability of war. And you see this from very early on in his sketches set in the Caucasus, right? What are the conditions and the social forces, right, behind creating a situation in which people lose their lives, while at the same time, right, engendering another situation where people are able to sort of capitalize on that grief, capitalize on this sort of violence. So it's not just war, right? War is inevitable. It's like disillusionment for Tolstoy. It's inevitable, it's going to happen. But rather so what matters is sort of our experience in managing this. But I mean, I believe it's Tolstoy who coins the phrase war, what is it good for?
You could be onto something.
Yeah, I think so.
Check the source. I'm interested. And then really, he didn't really develop his anti-war views until later in life, right?
That's later on, but it comes from his experiences soldiering in the Caucasus in the early 1850s, where he nearly loses his life. And although he's decorated and awarded for his bravery, he walks away from those experiences feeling very bitter and jaded by the whole experience. And you can see this in both War and Peace and Anna Karenina, where often a character's sort of patriotism is really sort of translated into terms of, selfishness. And you get a sense of how Tolstoy wants you to feel about certain characters by way of their attitude about war. So when Vronsky at the end of Anna Karenina is going off to war, right? In his mind, right, it's a way of going off to die, right? That diminishes for Tolstoy, diminishes any notion of this sort of patriotism surrounding this sort of pan-Slavic motivation behind Russia's involvement in the Russo-Turkish War of 1875, which I think is exactly what our listeners want to hear. I think I addressed it perfectly there. Everyone's the better for it.
Now we have a question from Betsy Vandenberg about the peace side of the book. She asks, I'm deeply interested in the peace or the Jane Austen side of War and Peace, the prosaic, the familial, the romantic. Very curious about literary influences on Tolstoy and have heard he was an admirer of Austen. Any thoughts on this connection?
I've learned bitterly from experience not to trespass onto the affections of Jane Austen enthusiasts. I once mistakenly stepped into a classroom talking about Jane Austen, and I said, you know, is this where I want to buy something or something like that? And they all became very, very angry with me. And so it's best not to sort of mess with the affections of Jane Austen enthusiasts. As far as well, I don't know. I mean, Nabokov thought that he didn't like Jane Austen because he felt like Jane Austen didn't care about any of the characters that she created. Now, I don't know if that's true, but the issue of peace here, I think, is a very important one. So the novel, from the outset, announces this opposition. There is war and there is peace, right? And the two seem to be sort of at odds. But what's so fascinating and quite brilliantly conceived in the novel is how Tolstoy really sort of blurs those lines. So even in moments of peace, right, those moments are characterized by violence. So you think of, like, you know, Pierre is not on the battlefield in any way, and yet he's challenging people to these ridiculous duels, right, putting himself in a situation where he could lose his life. Furthermore, there are moments, several quite well-known, brilliant moments in the novel where characters on the field of battle experience these moments, these epiphanic moments of peace, where they're recognizing, right, the grandeur of the heavens, the beautiful blue of the Danube, and that sort of thing. And so, so even though the novel announces this opposition, right, from the outset, there's war and there's peace. The novel seems much more interested in blurring those lines. The first conversation that takes place in the novel, right, is at this party setting where they're talking about war. So in this moment of what appears to be peace, the discussion nevertheless has to do with conflict. So it's not so easy. We shouldn't anticipate that our life will be sort of conducted in these neat categories, that today we're dealing with war and tomorrow we're dealing with peace. Tolstoy says not so fast, but rather, in fact, the two are constantly within us. And so is that?
Yeah, it seems like he shatters dichotomies. He likes to do that. He doesn't like to settle for these easy kinds of answers, or, you know, the consensus of what something means.
I mean,
so there's a question. Let me ask a question from David Joseph, unless you had more to say.
No, I'm all right.
He says, Dr. Purves, fantastic to see you chatting from this void under your office light. Tolstoy's book is overflowing with vivid scenes. The ball in which Andrei falls in love with Natasha, the hunt at the Rostov estate, and the Battle of Borodino, to name a few. What are your favorite scenes from the book? What do they say about the characters involved, about the nature of Russian life at the time, or about the nature of war and history in general?
Wow. So David, this is a former student of mine. So I'm happy that he's participating in this sort of thing. Favorite moments of mine typically have to do with the moments where an illusion, a character sort of labors under some illusion, only to see that illusion sort of challenged over time. And so, for instance, you think of Nikolai Rostov, where he's adamant about killing the French, and the French is this very sort of vague idea. And then there's this moment, quite famously, where he encounters a French soldier, and the detail is so powerful and yet so simple, we're told he encountered a French soldier with a dimple on his cheek, and Nikolai Rostov is totally overwhelmed by this. It's this humanizing instance for him, where his enemy is given a human face. And for me, this is one of the sort of identifying qualities of Tolstoy's worldview, which is this: the more pleasing any view of things is to the human mind, the less likely it is to reflect reality. What I mean by that is, of course, we have certain things figured out. Why? Because we have no interaction with them. I don't mean to, I'm sorry to keep bringing up Anna Karenina. There's this wonderful moment where Levin's brother, who's this total city guy, he comes in and he visits Levin on the estate, and his brother loves the peasants, right? His brother loves the peasants. And the reason he loves the peasants is because he has absolutely no interaction with them. Whereas we're told, if you were to ask Levin what his thoughts on the peasants were, he'd say, I don't know, some are nice, some are not, some are hardworking, some are lazy, right? Levin gives this completely sort of unimpressive philosophical response, which is to say, the further removed we are from a subject, the greater detail we're able to describe it. We're more authoritative about issues with which we have no familiarity. Right? Unlike the circumstances where we understand the ins and outs of them, and then the issue becomes much more complex. It's much more complicated than that. But I'm trying to think favorite moments. Well, one moment that I absolutely love in this novel is when the first time Nikolai Rostov rushes into battle, and he sees a French soldier, and he's about to lift his weapon, only to take his pistol and throw it at the opposing Frenchman. And we're told Rostov didn't understand what he was doing. So again, Rostov rushes into battle with this very clear idea of, I'm going to destroy the French. And then when he's put in a circumstance where that confrontation, right, would allow that, Rostov freaks out. He throws his pistol at the Frenchman. That's a moment that I really love. There's also another one. And I don't think you have to be a parent to appreciate it, but it might help. When Andrei comes back home, remember he's left his wife Lise with Andrei's very grumpy father. And Lise is when Andrei comes home, he finds that his wife is laboring and delivering, right, their son. And in the process, Lise dies. She dies in the process, right, in giving birth to their son. And all the while, right, Andrei knows this is happening. He's on the other side of the door, and he's hearing, right, he's listening to the sounds of his wife delivering and dying, right? And then when the baby starts to scream, Andrei tells himself, wait, who put that baby in that room? How is there a baby in there? Now, again, just to me personally, that speaks a lot, because, you know, my wife and I, well, we had 5 children. And, you know, you go to these doctor's visits and they show you, here's the gender, you know, here are fingernails, and you're given here's a heartbeat, right? That sort of thing. And you hear all of these, you're given all of this definitive evidence that, yes, there is a child growing. And yet on the moment of delivery, when that child comes into the world, right? My feeling has always been, what in the world is going on? How is there a baby right here? That seems utterly preposterous. How in the world did that actually take place? So I like that moment very much when it comes to Andrei. But again, what I'm trying to say is, the more pleasing any view of things is to the human mind, the less likely it is to reflect reality. So
we have many questions coming in. Let me just ask you to backtrack a bit and tell us about there are some powerful love stories in War and Peace. Do you have anything to say about those? I mean,
right. So you were talking about love stories, is that right?
Yeah.
So the way I would sort of reframe this is by considering this question of family happiness, which is a central issue in Anna Karenina, but the roots of which are planted in War and Peace. Now, this I think will come across as crude, but Tolstoy's notion of family happiness is much more optimistic in War and Peace than it is in Anna Karenina, I think. So when you think about it, the two chief couples in War and Peace, right? You have Natasha and Pierre, married, have children, who are enjoying a relationship of strong family stability. On the other hand, that's sort of not really even contrasted with Nikolai Rostov and Maria, who also enjoy a relationship of intimacy and trust and love. And the novel really does end on this very optimistic note that family happiness is in fact possible, where the whole prospect of that in Anna Karenina becomes it's much darker. I think, yeah, in that latter novel. But you know, I mean, the reason it seems that the two couples in War and Peace are successful is because they sort of have their issues, but they are able to manage the conflict in that relationship in an open and honest way.
Thanks.
Where I don't know if that can be entirely said of the sort of love, you know, couples in Anna Karenina.
No, I think that's true. So we have a question from Matthew Cheney. He asks, in the epilogue, one of the characters commits himself to reading every book he owns before buying any new ones.
Yeah.
Did Tolstoy consider reading as essential to being a proper man as dancing? Or is this just a part of that one character? What else did he consider essential to being a proper man or adult in general?
Well, exercise was important for him. And when you go to Tolstoy's estate, not only at Yasnaya Polyana, but at his Moscow estate in Khamovniki, you can see his weights, a bicycle. You get a glimpse into his sort of regimen. Now, he wasn't always consistent with this, but yeah, reading, of course, was essential. And I mean, this just gives you a glimpse into what European writers were doing in the 19th century. Tolstoy is sort of estimated while he's writing War and Peace and Anna Karenina, he's writing 7 to 8 hours a day. And then after which he's keeping a journal where he's thinking sort of out loud to himself about what he's been writing. And then he keeps a personal diary as well, where he's talking about his own experiences. So that's a lot. I mean, you have to be comfortable spending a lot of time with yourself to make that work. But what I'm reminded of as far as reading is a line by George Orwell, and I believe it's in his essay called Why I Write, where he says I knew I could be a writer. From a young age, I knew I could be a writer because I had the ability to face unpleasant facts. And that seems so much about the sort of creative process, is not just the ability to pinpoint what's wrong, but to go further than that and say, well, maybe I'm part of the very problem that I'm diagnosing. And the ability to face unpleasant facts. And it seems to me that the characters who are able to do this, to face the unpleasant facts of their own existence, they tend to be rewarded. They tend to succeed in Tolstoy's world. So yeah, reading is obviously essential for Tolstoy. I mean, it's funny because I know we're talking about War and Peace, but at the end of Anna Karenina, we're told Levin he makes this thorough go of both the materialist and anti-materialist writers, and he reads all of these writers, only to come to the conclusion that they don't tell him anything about who he is and what he wants. Now, that I don't think that's Tolstoy's way of saying don't read, because if Tolstoy is saying don't read, well, then he has a very interesting way of going about that, writing these huge, long novels, right? But it seems to be the problem of maybe overreading, or the expectation that, look, every sort of answer to the questions that you have can be found entirely in books. And that's, for Tolstoy, that's simply misguided.
So many of these questions have been answered by you in one way or another.
I'm sure.
I'm kind of going through them, but there's a question from Charlotte Nelson. She asks, in Anna Karenina, Levin's character portrays Tolstoy and his views. Does Tolstoy have a similar character in War and Peace that conveys his own views? Maybe his own personality as well. As
far as his own views, I think you could, relate that to pretty much everyone. Pierre, I had an advisor in graduate school, David Herman, who sort of keyed me into this understanding that what Tolstoy likes is social awkwardness. Characters who are socially awkward have sort of Tolstoy's approval. And Levin in Anna Karenina, and certainly Pierre Bezukhov in War and Peace, they're both socially awkward figures. And this is something that we'd have to accept as part of Tolstoy's own sort of understanding of himself. He thought he was unconnected. He certainly thought he was unattractive, and felt that he couldn't even begin to produce a sentence without embarrassing himself wildly. So as far as characters reflecting his views, I mean, certainly that's the case. But the social awkwardness that Tolstoy sort of resented about himself is worked into certain characters in his fiction.
And now we have a question from Emma Calderwood. She asks, during Pierre's imprisonment in part 4, he thinks of nothing but freedom. Surprisingly, though, after he's released, Pierre looks back on that time with fondness, citing the peace of mind and intensely pleasurable sensations he experienced. Are there any circumstances under which Tolstoy believes it's appropriate to look more to the future than the present?
Wow, I mean, I think he's much more interested in the present than he is in the future. One area where Tolstoy's characters fail is because of their obsession with what happens next, their obsession with what the future holds, because that usually comes at a cost of neglecting what matters in the immediate. I had something else. What was the beginning of that comment?
Just Pierre's imprisonment in part 4.
Oh, right. Much of this has to do with sort of Tolstoy's own sort of the stoicism that he wants to hold up as this virtue. That look, no matter how horrible the circumstances are, no matter how awful, the conditions that life imposes on us, one can nevertheless develop an inner zone of, say, peace and tranquility, a kind of contentment under even the worst circumstances. And we know of historical accounts where people living under regimes of clear depredation are nevertheless able to sort of develop a kind of happiness in their own right. Now, for some people, though, this smells. It stinks like a fish. So Chekhov, for instance, this is one of his misgivings with Tolstoy. So when Chekhov is reading Tolstoy and Tolstoy is saying, "Oh, suffering is this great thing. Isn't it so wonderful?" Chekhov, in a sense, is saying, only someone who's never suffered talks about the value of suffering. And so Tolstoy talks about Diogenes, right? This figure from Stoicist literature, who what we're told, Marcus Aurelius talks about him, right? That he could be happy no matter what. And he lived a life of poverty and lived in a barrel, and yet he was still happy. And Chekhov takes that and reworks that into a story called Ward Number 6 in 1892. And you have this character, the doctor, telling an imprisoned inmate, saying, well, look, anyone can be happy under any circumstance. Just think of Diogenes. And the inmate says, yes, well, Diogenes was an idiot. And this is sort of Chekhov's response to that Chekhov is very sort of uncomfortable with the idea that only the people who talk about the value of suffering, these are the very people who've never actually suffered at all. But I mean, my life I've been incredibly spoiled. I mean, from the cradle. So, I mean, I really can't speak of the sort of harsh depredation that someone like Pierre or other real people have actually endured.
Yeah. I think Pierre's imprisonment and the prisoners were taken on a kind of journey outside of Russia in a long chain of prisoners. What did that last? Maybe 4 or 5 months, you think? Something like that?
In Pierre's experience, no, it's about a week, I think.
Oh, okay.
But he is marched through, there's this very harrowing scene where he's marched along with his fellow prisoners through Moscow, where they do see sort of the bodies, the corpses littering the streets. And again, Pierre is made to sort of confront the reality of what he wanted. I mean, remember, again, this isn't a funny novel, but there are moments of humor. I mean, one of the things that should stand out to us about Pierre were his earlier sort of delusions of grandeur, that he, in fact, was born to destroy Napoleon, that Napoleon is the Antichrist, but I, Pierre, I'm here and I've been destined to destroy him, right? And you have to imagine sort of the hubris involved in that, right? Which is essentially, look, there's this horrible guy, his name's Napoleon, but don't worry, I'm here and I'm going to take care of it. You're welcome, right? And it's part of his own hubris and the illusory nature of his sort of thinking, that this is one of the things that lands him into prison to begin with. And that whole process, right, is one whereby Pierre has to sort of rethink to himself what actually matters.
Yeah. So during his march, he has this moment, it's kind of like a spiritual epiphany, in which I think he distances himself from the group and looks into the sky and says something like, I belong to the whole of existence. And so in a way, his imprisonment has kind of softened himself. And that reminds me a little bit of what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said about, bless these bars of prison, for they have made me who I am.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to be much more brittle in our responses. I mean, every time I gain 5 pounds, I sort of shake my fists at the heavens, thinking, what have I done to deserve such a cruel punishment, right? And yet, right, you have Pierre and you have these experiences where people suffering under horrible, horrible conditions are nevertheless able to sort of discover some kind of resolve. It engenders some kind of strength within them.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question, I believe, from your sister. She's asking, I'm wondering what you think about doors, Andre's dream on page 1093, and the little princess's birth, or the concept of space in general in the novel.
The image of the door is an important one in War and Peace, in sort of pointing up Tolstoy's thoughts on the relationship between life and death. And the door it's not something that's just open or just closed. If you think about it, this is true when Pierre's father dies, and it's definitely true when Lise dies toward the beginning of the novel, is the image of the swinging door. So the door swings one way to tell Pierre his father has died, and then it swings the other way to tell Pierre he's now just inherited this huge fortune. The door swings one way to tell Andre that his wife has died, and then it swings the other way to tell Andre that he's now become a father. And so it's constantly swinging. It's unlike, and if this sounds like a stretch, I apologize. When you think of Bob Dylan's use of the door, right, you think knocking on heaven's door, or his song trying to get to heaven before they close the door. The door is an image of finality, that the door shuts and it doesn't open. And so you got to hurry your way to heaven. You got to get there because the door is going to close, and you're just, you have to hope that you won't be on the other side knocking for it to open, because it won't. In Tolstoy, it's a much more forgiving image. The door is constantly swinging. In Anna Karenina, the door swings open to tell Levin and Kitty that Levin's brother Nikolai has died. And then it swings the other way, right, with the announcement that Kitty is pregnant. And so there's this life and death connection, because the margins, for Tolstoy, the margins between life and death are so very small that the door must be swinging. It's moving one way and then moving the other. It's not an image of finality.
So there's a question about translation, and you've spoken a lot about which translation you prefer in previous lectures you've given. Can you tell us briefly which ones you think are the best?
Of War and Peace? Or,
yeah, War and Peace.
I like the Maud translation. It's an earlier one. It feels maybe a bit stiff, but I think it's a very, very serviceable translation. The Constance Garnett translation, especially in its later sort of redactions, I think is very, very good. I read, with my students, I read the Anthony Briggs translation, which I think is quite beautifully done in many ways. It can be a bit British. So Nathan, I think we talked about this before. So you have, these unlettered, uneducated soldiers, right? Peasants conscripted into the army, and they're, they're talking on the field of battle. And again, they have no education. And yet in the Briggs translation, they sound, they say things like, shift on over, old bean, or come on, dear man, you can do this, right? So you have these uneducated peasants who sound like, they come out of a Jeeves and Wooster novel, or that they went to Cambridge or something like this. So those are, I mean, some concerns, but I like the Briggs translation. And there are other more popular translations, but that to me aren't as satisfying as the Briggs translation.
Let me just ask you a general question about literature. What in your mind makes a piece of literature great, that lasts the test of time?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think in striking this balance between exploring a broad idea on one hand, while conceptualizing and realizing that idea on a very sort of ordinary level. But for me, what great art does, and here I'm going to sound like just a complete phony, but for me, what great art does is it reminds us of our own sort of liabilities. But more than that, it instructs us how to experience joy with gratitude. To me, that's what good art does. No matter what expression that takes, is it instructs us to experience joy with gratitude. That's what I would say. Now, is that sort of maudlin? Could all of that be sort of placed within a Hallmark card? Probably, but I don't worry about that sort of thing anymore.
So, and what is it about Russian literature that seems to be distinct and have a little bit more depth to it that makes it so appealing to so many people still? Any ideas?
I don't know. I mean, I do. I mean, I think I have answers I feel like I'm supposed to say, but to be totally honest, I'm not really sure. I can only tell you that my favorite authors come from Russia, and so I'm quite glad when people, are discussing them. I mean, I love Chekhov, for instance, so much that even when I see a bad Chekhov play, I'm still happy. I'm still happy that people are doing Chekhov. I don't care if it's a poor production. It still makes me enormously happy to see it put before the people, if you will. Mm-hmm. But for me, sort of the overarching, I think of sort of the great Russian novels that have made such an impression in my life is this idea of learning how to undergo suffering without resentment. And as a way of, be honest about it, of bringing you to the kind of person that God has intended you to be.
Well, thank you very much.
That's it.
I think we'll probably end our discussion on that positive note. I think we've had a great conversational, candid, pretty free-flowing conversation. I appreciate you coming on. Mark, do you have any last words? Actually, we have one more question if you don't mind answering that.
Who is it from?
It's from Bill Swadley. I don't think he's one of your old students, but he's a good friend.
Forget it.
He says, what are Tolstoy's thoughts on self-imposed suffering? It seems that several characters had the opportunity to bypass these difficult moments, but instead threw themselves in harm's way.
I need to be given an example. Threw themselves in harm's way. I mean,
maybe Andre when he charged in the with the flag.
Well, one moment we could talk about Andre, but Andre has a sense, nevertheless, of how military campaigns should be conducted. For me, one thing that stands out is when Pierre, he kits out an entire regiment. He spends thousands and thousands of rubles, right, to sort of make provide all the necessary means for a whole company, right, at the Battle of Borodino. And because of this, Pierre somehow thinks that makes him capable of rushing into the field of battle. And the image of him, it's so ridiculous. He rushes into battle, his glasses are sliding down, he can't see anything. He's sweating, he's just a huge mess. He's an enormous target anyway. How he doesn't get killed is it beggars belief. And then when he throws himself down by that pile of grape shot, which explodes right in front of him, for Pierre, he needs to sort of see that action. He needs to put himself into that circumstance in order to appreciate it. And though his life is not shattered, his illusions completely are.
Hmm.
So, yeah, anyway.
Thanks. Well, thank you again very much. I hope everyone goes out and reads War and Peace over the
I hope
Christmas
so
break,
too. Yeah.
over
And
the
even if you
Thanksgiving
don't
break.
read War and Peace, the Cliff Notes are excellent. They're very, very good. So,
No, never, never trust that statement. Cliff notes are
anyway,
no
thank you
good.
so much for having me.